Transforming Transportation in its 20th edition gathered right here in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank headquarters to consider the current economic times, the post-COVID-19 recovery and COP27 commitments to reimagine transport as a more safer, accessible and even more sustainable for everyone. I'm Eugene Anangwe and this is a special edition on Transforming Transportation 2023.
A record-breaking 2,800 participants attended the forum, in person and virtually. The event kicked off with powerful keynote addresses from Guangze Chen, Vice President for Infrastructure at the World Bank, and Ani Dasgupta, CEO and President, World Resources Institute, who emphasized the urgent need to prioritize sustainable transportation as a key component of responding to the current climate crisis.
But as difficult as the current challenge may be, it is also providing a unique opportunity for us to rethink transport in a fundamental way. We need to expand access to transport so that everyone can benefit, but at the same time drastically reducing the negative impact, particularly climate impact of the transport system. In other words, we want to provide more mobility with fewer side effects.
We gather here every year, hopefully every year, to talk about what transportation needs and how everything is not going up to speed. Actually, in transportation, things are not going the speed with which we need. We all know that. Transportation is one of the lagging sectors of transformation. We all know that. But we need now to bring together how we collectively can bring this transformational shifts. This time for doing a sector at a time, one thing at a time, it's just not there. We know that the transport sector and its criticality, and if it doesn't shift, it'll be impossible to meet 1.5 degree or biodiversity goal or nature goal, or more importantly, goals of poverty reduction and equality. We all know these are interconnected. That this is the kind of systems transformation that we need. This is why WRI, with our partners, we put together something called the System Change Lab to see how to look at the sector and sectors across that are interconnected as systems.
What both the World Bank and the World Resources Institute are saying is that to transform transportation, a much larger commitment of capital will be needed to modernize the transportation systems and also make sure the electric sector is prepared to provide power for electric mobility where it is needed most. This integration of transportation and electrification presents both challenges and also incredible opportunities. Holmes Hummel, Managing Director, Energy Equity and Just Transitions, Stanford University, weighs in on the opportunities.
One thing that we know now is that the electric power sector, once it is fully renewable, does benefit from having buffers in the system, including energy storage. And it turns out that the battery costs that have plummeted by 90% over the course of the last decade or so present such a sponge, an ability to provide flexibility to the grid when and where it needs it most. One of the innovations that's making that possible, and really making news this year, is the seam between the electric power sector and the transportation sector, where electricity can go in both directions. These are electric vehicle chargers that can turn the batteries that are bolted to wheels into a resource that helps us stabilize the grid when it's most vulnerable. This actually produces a more affordable transition path for both the renewable energy in the grid and fossil freedom out of the transportation sector.
The intersection between gender and transport and how the private sector can make transport infrastructure more gender inclusive is key. Emmanuel Nyiringindi, IFC's Vice President of Cross-Cutting Solutions, shares more.
women in the transport sector are underrepresented in jobs, and particularly in quality jobs. So, give you a number. Only about 20% of the workforce is of a female gender. So a huge missed opportunity to not only bring more women into the workforce, but also bring them in all the dimensions, in skilled transportation jobs, in the seniority of those jobs. So I mentioned a 20% number. In one of the projects that we were doing with our clients, ASSA is the acronym, ASA, it's in Indonesia. Working with them, we were able to design programs where we ramped that number up to 85, 88%, right? So significant opportunity. If we look at some of the additional numbers that we could, if we address gender, there is a huge opportunity to pump that number of 20%. So if you went to 35, 40%, would be a significant shift and change. Second thing that I wanted to mention about women is women as consumers and the users of transportation systems. If you look at how women use them as passengers, right, we notice different uses than for men. For example, women always usually have family members with them. They have specific concerns about violence, about safety, gender-based violence. We've seen incidences on trains. So we need to be designing transactions deliberately or projects deliberately to address that aspect of it. We see that women also lack access to assets like vehicles for transportation. There are in some parts of the world cultural norms that are prohibitive to women moving on public transportation. And then very much we want women also to have access to transportation that enables them to earn incomes, right? Because that's good for the whole economy, not just any one country, but also for 50% of the human population.
With the rapid development of new technologies such as autonomous vehicles and ride-sharing platforms, active mobility modes such as cycling and walking will play a major role in the future of urban mobility.
So we have to understand that informality is something important. We have to allow people to work, to have this access to jobs, and we have to understand that context. So that's why 2 and 3-wheelers are so important in Africa, and we have to understand that's also public transportation. So we have to encourage these kind of things, organize and regulate some of these things in terms of policies within each of the cities. So we have to understand that each geography is different. We have to understand what finance tools you need, what kind of public transport you need, and from there start building something that is very important: sustainable transportation. Walking, biking, and public transport, not understand that by using trains only, but also buses, 2 and 3-wheelers, shared bike systems, whatever is made for sustainable transportation.
That today's global challenges are putting serious pressure on transport systems is no longer news. From climate change, COVID-19 to conflict and macroeconomic instability, investment in resilient infrastructure will be important for the people and businesses that rely on it.
The evidence broadly across the world shows the importance of infrastructure, not just for economic growth, but broader development. So it's not questionable. We're also seeing that the region is really subject to shocks, particularly climate shocks. So resilient transport is super critical. In terms of the costs, the estimates suggest that for low and middle income countries, the natural hazards that come, which resilient infrastructure can help us avoid or respond better to, these natural hazards, just in power and in road infrastructure, costs about $18 billion, the costs, but then if you take the broader costs of these natural hazards combined with poor maintenance of transport infrastructure and just inadequate access to resilient infrastructure, the cost is about $390 billion for lower and middle income countries. So that's a huge cost. If you take Tanzania, for example, and you look at just the floods and the impact on road infrastructure, costs about $100 million every year. Now, so you get a sense of the magnitude. These are huge numbers that we're talking about. On the other side, the evidence also shows that investments in resilient transport infrastructure has huge benefits in the order of about $4.2 trillion, again for low and middle income countries. And for every dollar invested, you gain about $4 of return. So there's a lot at stake here, and the cost benefit analysis shows that it really makes sense to make these investments.
Despite their low contribution to the global greenhouse gas emissions at only 4%, African countries continue to bear the brunt of the climate crisis. Climate financing is still not at the desired levels.
So, and I will tell you very openly, Eugene, I struggle at the moment to understand why we're not able to mobilize as much climate funding for Africa as I feel we should be able to. There are a lot of global climate funds out there, and more are being set up. But the criteria, when you look at it, are so emission reduction focused that we're having a hard time accessing for Africa. I will be very frank about this. And that needs to change. We've sort of, even internally in the World Bank, kind of voiced Africa cannot be left out. So you're absolutely right. The financing right now is an issue to access. And we need to make that available, because countries in the region can only do that if the funding is available.
Could we talk about the World Bank specific work in that area? You know, if you're looking at probably deliberate attempts to try and improve the issues around transportation on the continent, what would you be reporting back home on this?
So I think I would say, first of all, so we kind of work across three pillars. One is to make sure that the many Africans who have no access to any road, any sort of road, get connected. So the issue of really just basic accessibility is really still very much there. It's a country that has the highest number of people completely isolated. Second is urban mobility. African cities are the fastest growing in the world. And as of now, people are moving into cities, and cities are starting to get clogged, and there's no public transport system. We're working very, very hard on helping cities that are on this sort of growth trajectory of growing 4 to 5% annually to set up a public transport system. And there again, the decarbonization angle is twofold, right? You could see that some trains, for example, if they could be run electric in countries where the energy is there for that, then that could sort of, for once bring people into a public transport system instead of everybody wanting to own an individual car. And second, to decarbonize at the same time. And the third angle, third pillar that we're working with a lot of governments on is regional integration. Africa remains, sub-Saharan Africa especially, the least integrated region on the planet. The borders are what we call very thick. It's very difficult to cross. And yet Africa has, the ability to feed each other across the continent a lot more than it's doing right now. I think right now only 1 to 5% of imports are coming from within Africa, whereas in Europe it's 60%. So, and that can change. It's not that there is no fertile land available, it's available. But getting produce out and safely to the end consumer, that's the problem. A third of all food is getting lost. Food production is getting lost on the way.
But what would be the ideal models to finance sustainable urban mobility?
That's a very important question, particularly nowadays. In the last couple of years, we are seeing sort of reversing trend in terms of the sort of public sector fiscal positions. I mean, many of the low-income countries are facing that stress, and investing in transportation typically is based on public financing. But when the government does not have sufficient money to invest in that you're falling behind. So I think our role is a several fund. Again, we provide our catalytic financing. I mean, last fiscal year, for example, we set a record of over $8 billion investment in transport sector. Of course, that's not sufficient to meeting the need, but we're also using our sort of convening power, but also the whole of the World Bank Group with IFC, with MICA, to really bring the private sector money. One figure I should mention, I think last year we estimated the top 500 sort of global asset management company, they manage over $100 trillion of asset. Now, even if 10% of this money can move to a developing country, will make a huge difference. But it's not easy, because they obviously, all this money, they're not they're not grants, they're not donations, they're looking for profits. So we have to find an environment that will make them conducive so we could try to manage their risk profiles, trying to create an environment that they think is relatively less risk for them to invest. At the same time, we're making sure that utility that manage this transport asset can generate revenue that can repay some of these investments moving forward.
Throughout the event, participants engaged in lively panel discussions on a range of topics, from electrification of transportation to building transport for resilient communities.
About 100 kilometers of roads have been cleared. About 120 kilometers of roads were repaired, and we are not stopping. In recently deoccupied regions, we are continuing to repair, we are continuing to restore. At the same time, almost 900 railway kilometers facilities were restored, different objects, different bridges, stations, because Ukrainian railways is also critical for military assistance, for humanitarian support, and as well for our economy, because our economy is still working. Yes, we dropped significantly during previous year, but anyway, all our key industries, they survived, they are working, they are paying taxes, and they help us to win this war.
Somalia is not a rich country. We are a very poor country, struggling to pay our bills. And so when it comes to investment and planning, it's very difficult for us. So that's luckily we have World Bank and partners like that to help us sometimes. But right now we are planning to reconstruct our country, like to rebuild our roads, and we don't have any transportation on public transportation for the government. We don't have no train, no buses, nothing. Everything is private in Somalia. All the transportation we have is private. So when we are thinking and planning to reconstruct our system, road, transportation system and everything, so that's where we are now. That's the top priority for us, to rebuild everything from scratch. And then we can think about what the rest of the world is thinking about.
Yeah, in our mobility plan 2035, we made a new classification of our roads, because the road is an infrastructure for mobility. And in the mindset that we had in our society, that we still have in our society, is that roads are there for cars. And we did a complete new classification. We said a road is a multimodal corridor for every mode of transport. So if we build a new road, impossible to not think immediately that there is enough space on this road, for example, for pedestrians, for cyclists, for trams, for buses, for everything that you need in the mobility system. And that's a different approach. So, and then we did a classification also for roads inside of urban areas, outside of urban areas, and then to look to really that inside of the urban area, humans are the most important things that we have to look at. Because the urban area, the car is tolerated in the city, from my opinion, or in the village. The car should be tolerated. It should be possible for the car to go from A to B where it wants in the city, but only it's not the same if you run inside the city or if you run outside the city. So a complete new classification. And with this, we retrofit, in fact, then the mobility system in general.
We are looking at resilient transport, navigating climate and conflict and disruption. I would like you to give our audience online and in the room one recommendation from your experience. What would you like to recommend they do when they're also in that same situation? Aaron is looking thoughtful. Unleash the thoughts.
I would say agility, agile governments, agile departments, agile authorities, embracing change but also anticipating it.
Francois.
Not being fixed too much on technology, but seeing also the low-hanging fruits and creating a mobility system where you have to move people and not vehicles.
Fidauza. You thought you had extra time, but you do not.
I would say help the developing countries like us, people in this room.
Your recommendation is help Somalia.
Yes.
I like it, it's very direct.
Pak Gubernur dari Bali, silakan kira-kira rekomendasi ada yang memberikan soal transportasi yang ketahanan ini. First, so to make people realize that the needs of transportation that effective, efficient, and environmental friendly, that pollute the air. Secondly, to make people realize to use the public transportation, to reduce the personal car and the transportation that public transportation that we design here. So we for the people in Bali and the tourists, so it could be resilient and sustainable. Terima kasih banyak.
I would say we really need to work hard to make sure the hundreds and millions of people in Africa that don't have access to transport infrastructure and the mobility infrastructure get access to it by thinking creatively, thinking outside the box, and not focusing only on technical solutions, but bringing in other elements that can make it affordable for all.
A global audience of over 2,000 policymakers and industry leaders, 5 plenaries, 15 technical sessions, exclusive networking opportunities, and knowledge exhibitions. The Transforming Transportation 2023 did not leave out any topic on transportation, including the future of paratransit modes of transportation in the midst of rapid urbanization.
Paratransit, I mean, most of the experts around mobility and even in the urban context, they consider it as like informal and everything. Look at, I will tell you the urbanization process in Africa. You know, about 60% of people living in urban area in Africa are living in informal centers. So this, you know, the modes of transport that are considered as informal are the dominant sectors in providing mobility in African cities, because informality requires those evidence. So I think that are really very good opportunity to address equity and really address like mobility to the ground, because if we address paratransit, then we are really trying to drive the mobility process in Africa, and also about integrating it into the main modes, the existing, you know, routes. The formal ones is also a major area to look at. And then if you address the informality or the paratransit, then you are addressing the informal sector. Addressing informal sector meaning also is about equity.
But even as we look to the pathway the world needs to be on by 2030 in order to meet the Paris climate goals, Ani Dasgupta, CEO and President, World Resources Institute, shares what needs to be done now in order to enable the change needed in the transport sector.
You know, African cities are the fastest growing cities in the world right now, because urbanization in Africa is happening in the fastest pace than any other place in the world. But the African cities are growing horizontally. So every time they're growing, they're creating more transportation problems. So first thing we need to do, we need to build cities that actually reduces the distance to travel, so that we're actually building more compact cities, which is most possible in the sub-Saharan Africa simply because cities are growing. Second, we need to build real public transport. Public transport is the biggest transition that can happen from getting people, because people go to cars because they don't have or other options. So building public transport, in most cases will be built based on buses, but could be others. There are metros somewhere where there's high density. But public transport has to incorporate, you know, the informal transport that exists in our cities. The matatus of the world, the bicycles of the world, the tricycles, to create an integrated service, because transportation needs to reach everyone. So the biggest change that needs to happen is both. We need to decarbonize, so make things electric. So there's really good things that are happening in electrification of buses, motorbikes, bajais. but also get it to access, get public transport, get biking, cycling going. So I think what we need is build cities that is actually more compact. Africa has the most opportunity because the new cities are being built as we speak. You live in Kigali, you've seen it yourself. The second is to build robust public transport that is multimodal, buses, bikes, other modes, three-wheelers. And then the third thing is electrify as much as we can when it makes sense. So those are the things that are doable, and I see change happening in all three of them. But I must tell you that I don't see change happening as fast as it needs to happen.
Right, and that's what I'm going to pick up from. How do we increase this pace? What needs to be done, or what could be the missing link that is causing the slow uptake to the level that you wish to see, that you're not seeing today?
I think, first of all, the good news is big game-changing transformational solutions are happening in the world. So we can see and learn from it. It's not that India, for example, just procured 5,000 buses. 5,000 buses in one go, 6 states together. And by procuring 5,000 buses, they reduced the cost of electric buses. So not 5,000 buses, 5,000 electric buses. One of the big barrier of electrification of buses, public transport, is cost, because normally electric buses are more expensive than diesel buses. So the barrier to cost, But in this particular procurement, Indian government make it so big, 5,000, when they got the bids back, the price of the selected bids was 27% lower than a diesel bus. So in one game-changing solution, you have changed the market. What I'm saying is things like this happen, but it's not happening everywhere. So what needs to happen is big, really collaborative solutions like that brings market, government, cities together. That's number one. The other is finance. I think cities today know what the solutions are, or know where to go to get solutions. It's not that they don't know what to do. I think networks like ours and others and many others that actually is able to bring the knowledge to cities. So when I go meet city mayors, they have a plan, or at least they know how to get a plan. The question is, how do you get finance in place? Two things. One is we need to get more finance, like the World Banks of the world, on the sustainable transportation. But the second also, I think we need to find a way to get central governments to focus more on public transport or transport, because it has a huge benefit on poverty reduction, on access, on making quality of life for people better, getting people to jobs and schools. And of course, it's a huge climate outcome, meaning not polluting the air. So finance and big system change solutions is what I feel the real momentum is.
Right. Now, as the biggest activities in the transport events calendar came to a close in Washington, D.C., it is emerging that conversations around building resilient and sustainable transport are gaining momentum. We're looking forward to seeing the transformation and technologies that will emerge from this conference. This has been a special edition on Transforming Transportation 2023, and I'm Eugene Anangwe. Thank you for watching.